Still lots more to cover, so let's go straight to my next guest, Center of the American Experiment President John Hinderaker. John Hinderaker, thank you so much for joining us on the program. And I want to ask you, as a lawyer, about your reaction to the Durham report, especially about how this seems to be a gross dereliction of prosecutorial responsibilities if no one winds up paying any price for what that report has revealed.
Well, what the report showed, James, is that the whole Trump-Russia collusion hoax was ridiculous. The FBI knew it was ridiculous early on, and they participated along with the Democratic National Committee, Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, the CIA, and a number of other malefactors in deliberately driving this false narrative for years. There are many facts you could pull out here, James. One of my favorites, so to speak, is that when the FBI had talked to Christopher Steele, who put together the famous Steele dossier that was nothing but lies, as we now know, and Steele admitted to them that he had nothing. He had no support for anything that was in that so-called dossier. The FBI said, well, if you ever do come up with any dirt on Donald Trump, we'll pay you $1 million. Okay? That is how in the tank the FBI is for the Democratic Party. And frankly, that's the environment that we're living in here in the United States.
Well, but I mean, we've seen so many times now where it also looks like the FBI doesn't just go after Donald Trump, but they've gone after, Catholic churches, school board meetings, anybody who steps out of line of the narrative. We've seen how with the Twitter files that the FBI and other alphabet agencies have worked with social media to decide what people can talk about. This strikes me to be incredibly un-American, and I would think that in a normal world, I was talking about this at the top of the show, the left would be outraged by the way law enforcement and these intelligence agencies and everybody else that they once upon a time taught us all to be paranoid about have been behaving.
James, there's been a huge realignment in American politics, as you know. Organizations like the FBI and the CIA are now firmly in the camp of the Democratic Party and the American left. They're right there with the New York Times, Washington Post, and so forth. And you're right. I mean, they're attacking parents who express concern at school board meetings about left-wing indoctrination in the public schools. And the FBI is trying to classify those people as domestic terrorists. I mean, this is a completely different world from the one that I grew up in, where people on the left were skeptical and critical of the FBI and the CIA. That's not true any longer.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, but I grew up watching movies like 3 Days with the Condor and things like that, where there was always the stuff about the shadowy deep state. Well, it turns out the deep state is real. But anyway, let's talk about another story which just depresses me no end, and it's the death of the great American city. I have always loved Chicago, but it seems like Chicago is now on a path to utter self-destruction. They've elected a new woke mayor, Brandon Johnson, who wants a $12 billion financial package to raise taxes for certain residents, I would say income-producing ones. You wrote about this on your Powerline blog. Talk us through just how bonkers some of these proposals are.
James, it's really unbelievable. People thought that Chicago had hit the bottom of the barrel when they elected Lori Lightfoot as mayor, and crime just spiraled out of control. The economy in Chicago is in the dumps. And there was a mayoral election, and Lori Lightfoot did lose, but she lost to this guy, Brandon Johnson, on her left. If you can imagine that, Chicago's voters went for a more left-wing candidate than Lori Lightfoot. So now they put together this proposal to raise an additional $12 billion in taxes to fund what they call a just Chicago. Well, it turns out that a just Chicago, among other things, means defunding the police. So they want to raise $12 billion from Chicago residents with a 3.5% income tax, with a wealth tax, with a huge tax on jet fuel to catch people flying in and out of the city, and so forth. And they're not going to spend that $12 billion to make Chicago safer, which is what everybody wants. You'd think everybody wants.
What do you think?
Instead, they're going to make it more just.
Just. Well, I mean, we're hearing that word abused a lot. And is it true that the name of this program is called First We Get the Money? I mean, that does kind of give it away, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right. It's like a gang of thieves. First we get the money, then we'll figure out how to divvy it up. It's a very sad story, James. But Chicago's not alone. San Francisco, Portland, other American cities are just circling the drain, frankly.
It's a real shame because, you know, the great American city used to be a wonderful thing, as we both know. But I want to move on to another story, which is disturbing and strange, but also tells us a bit about where we are. And we've seen more than 60 legislators in Tennessee signing a letter in Tennessee calling for the Metro Nashville police to release the manifesto of that shooter who shot up the Covenant School a couple of months ago. John, normally when there's a shooter and a manifesto, we generally get it right away. Why do you think it is taking so long for this document about this terrible, horrible crime to be released?
Well, James, I think we can only assume it's because this manifesto indicates that Audrey Hale was motivated to commit this mass murder by the radical trans movement, which she had just joined shortly before she carried out these murders. And these murders took place right before a national so-called Trans Day of Vengeance that was being promoted by the leaders of this increasingly violent movement. And they had a lot of violent imagery. Stop the genocide, they're saying, which of course is insane. But this woman, Audrey Hale, had become a recent convert to this trans movement. And I think everybody believes that if we finally see the manifesto, we're going to find out that she was motivated to do this by this very radical and very violent trans ideology.
Yeah, it is that ideology, which we've seen so many times before. Not, what trans people are involved in, but a certain wing that is very, very disturbing. And, just sort of in a kind of a related but somewhat lighter note, Sam Brinton, you will all remember him, the non-binary activist who was tapped by Joe Biden for the role of managing the United States' nuclear waste before he was fired for allegedly stealing luggage all over the country. Well, remember this one? He has been arrested again Wednesday night as a fugitive from justice for allegedly stealing luggage. What's the latest on this? But also, how does somebody like this wind up with a security clearance and a top nuclear job?
James, there are a lot of strange people in the Biden administration. Sam Brinton, obviously, one of the strangest. He's a guy, he's bald, he wears red lipstick, he's got a mustache, he wears women's clothes. He's a nuclear engineer. He certainly could afford to buy his own dresses and women's underwear, but for some reason he prefers to steal them. So we know of at least 3 instances where he has been in airports and he's gone to the carousel where the baggage comes out, and he'll watch for like a pink piece of luggage, something that's obviously a woman's suitcase, and he'll steal it. He'll pick it up like it's his and walk out with him. He's done this at least 3 times that we know of. One of them in my hometown airport, just a few miles from my home here in Minnesota. And then he'll wear these women's clothes that he has stolen from the airports. And for some reason, this is his preferred way of getting women's clothes. He's done it at least 3 times that we know of. He's now been kicked out of the Biden administration. James, even the Biden administration has some limits. I guess we should take this as a glimmer of optimism.
Well, John Hinderaker, I think we have to take our hope and our little shafts of light from heaven wherever we can find them. Thank you so much for joining us here.